and welcome to the Satire Fire, the podcast that is the world state's #1 banned podcast. I am your host, Sydney.
And I am your #2 band co-host, Samuel.
Number 2, wow. Putting yourself in
I'm
second
assuming
there.
that, at the very least for this week, if you're leading the charge, it's got to be you as #1 most banned. Number 2
banned.
is me. Number 3, I think, is Alex Jones.
William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
He's on the hit list for the world state. So yeah, I think maybe you just gathered that this week is a little bit different. So if you have been listening to our podcast thus far, first of all, thank you. I love you. I'm sure Samuel loves you too. I don't know. Don't want to speak for him, but
I also love you.
But you probably have noticed that Samuel's a yapper. Samuel's been talking a lot, and that's because he's been leading our series on 1984, which we just finished up last week. Well, I guess 2 weeks ago, but then we did our bonus episode in between. So if you're new here, what we do is we read books and then we talk about them. We read satirical novels, and depending on the book, it's about 3 episodes per book. There's a first just basic plot summary episode, then there's a historical context author background episode, and then an analysis episode. If it's longer, there might be a couple analysis episodes, and then we finish off a series with an in-between bonus episode where we consume another type of satirical media. It could be a movie, it could be poetry, it could be a short story, it could be songs, it could be anything. So if you are interested in the book 1984 by George Orwell and you haven't been listening, I would recommend going and checking out those episodes. But if you are here today because your favorite book is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, you're in luck, because that's what we're talking about.
I don't know if that's true. If you love Brave New World, I am going to talk shit about Brave New World. So,
but if you're here today because you hate Brave New World with a burning passion, you're also in luck. No matter what, no matter what you think about Brave New World, you're in luck because we're going to be talking about it. Today we're going to go through just the basic plot summary. Here's what happens in Brave New World. So if you've read it recently or a long time ago and you don't want to relive that experience, feel free to skip this episode. I would love it if you listen, because it's my first summary episode, because I'm taking the lead on this one. That's why I'm the #1 banned podcast host. So, Samuel, what have you been up to this week? Any fun things? Any good books you're reading?
Let's see. I have been on a Percival Everett kick lately. I had previously already read his book, The Trees. That was my introduction to Percival Everett, was with The Trees. And then this past year, I got into James. And I really enjoyed both of those books. I don't know if I could say that I liked one more than the other. I felt like they were both very, very good, though. And so I decided that I wanted to spend some more time with him as an author. So I started by reading Erasure, which is the book of his that got adapted into the movie American Fiction. And I enjoyed that one pretty well. I thought that it was a pretty good book. My biggest critique of the book was just that, it's not even a critique, it's just a sticking point for me, was that if you're not familiar with the premise of the book, it's essentially a black academic who writes novels and nonfiction books, but mainly like Greek myth retellings, who has a very tough time finding commercial success, and also is very frequently placed into the category of African American literature or African American studies and stuff like that. Instead of being put in just plain fiction, his books are being categorized based on who he is as a person. And he's looking around and seeing that in the world, the current most popular best-selling book is a book written by a black college graduate, academic, upper class person who is basically leaning into a tremendous amount of stereotypes about people of color in order to tell a story about a lower socioeconomic family. And if this was a book that had been written by a white person, it would have immediately been said, oh no, that's an incredibly racist thing to say and to do and to write that book. But because the person who wrote it was of color, it's instead seen as this really poignant and thoughtful example of what life is like for them. Like the media is taking that book as, oh, this is a raw portrait of you speaking for your people, basically taking their own internalized biases, and because somebody that is in that specific group is reflecting them back at them, they're saying, oh, that must be the true story. And so this author, out of frustration, just writes a hateful parody book called My Pathology, spelled with an F, and writes it from the perspective of somebody who grew up really poor and was a criminal and had all these like very stereotypical things happen to them and things that they did throughout their life. And it goes on from there, and he gets a lot of commercial and critical success as a result of this book. But the thing that I didn't really like is that a third of this book, like 100 pages or so of this book, was just my pathology. Like, he just writes the entire fake book inside of the other book, which I understand from like a framing perspective and from a satirical perspective. Seeing exactly word for word what was written is useful in interpreting the work as a whole. But the conceit of the book is that My Pathology is a bad book. And so you've dedicated 100 pages of your book to a worse book. And so you just spend this time in the middle of a really good book reading a pretty bad book. So I liked it. I don't think that I liked it as much as I liked James or The Trees. I think that both of those are a little bit better in my opinion, but I liked it a lot, and I think that the next time we record, I will have finished another of his books that I will talk about, because like I said, I'm on a kick, and I really like him.
That's such an interesting premise for a book.
Yeah, I feel like it would be a really good companion piece with Yellowface, because both of them are people of color writing about the publishing industry from their perspective, where it's almost as though in order for you to participate in the broader cultural context of the publishing industry, you have to put on a face of what those people in those industries expect you to be. Mm-hmm. And you can't just rely on who you are as a person.
I haven't read Yellowface, but I'm sure we will at some point on the podcast.
I think that we should probably do it soon. It's pretty popular.
Yeah. I thought about it at one point, but then I wasn't in like the mood for that type of literature, and then I just never came back to it. And yeah, so I haven't been reading anything but prepping for Brave New World this week, really, in my little bits of free time. But something fun I did this week was last night I went to the Charli XCX concert for her Brat 2025 tour. Very tired today, but that's okay.
It's still Brat summer, baby.
But it's still Brat summer. That was it. That was how the concert ended. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't gone or is invested in how long Brat summer will last. I think the answer is forever. So Brat summer 2090, I'm going to be in the nursing home bumping that. It was really fun. I love Charli. She amazes me as a performer, because I mean, there are a lot of theatrics in terms of like lighting and display on screen display. I don't know what you call that, but she doesn't have any dancers or any type of like, it's just her on the stage at all times. And there is choreography to an extent, I'm sure, but she's kind of just like it's like she's at the club and she's just going crazy. And she captivates this entire arena of people in doing that. Like, she has such a presence that like demands attention, and that impresses me, because I mean, I also think like very choreographed, production oriented shows are great too, and a feat in themselves, but there's something to be said for just like you on a stage and everyone's at attention. And it's so fun. It really feels like you're at a club with your best friend Charli XCX. But I really enjoyed it. I would recommend, if you're not a fan of Brat, I would recommend listening to some other Charli XCX too, because she has, I mean, I feel like Brat has been popularized for its kind of like upbeat, that kind of like club type music, which is great and I love, but not everyone does. But she also has some slower songs, and she has some more, you know, emotionally charged songs, and she has some just like poppy songs. I don't know, I feel like everyone should give Charli a chance. And I love that she's getting this kind of massive success right now.
Yeah. I've never listened to Brat.
Wow.
I have listened to Charli. I've listened to Charli XCX, but I think that I've mainly listened to, was it Crash? Her album that is more like hyper pop.
Yeah.
I've listened to a lot of Crash, but I haven't listened to Brat yet.
Well, you know, like I said, it's not for everybody, so I take all critiques about music, unless they're bad. If it's a bad take, but like, I can see how Brat might not be for everyone. But that being said, it's for me forever.
No, I mean, just to give Charli, if you're listening, some heads up, you've got a little bit of competition, because I was at a movie theater last night watching a horror movie where the host of the event proclaimed it to be Slime Girl Summer. So just letting you know, you're gonna have to, you're competing with Slime Girl Summer. So
yeah, I'm sure the Slime Girl Summer crowd is really ready to overtake the Brat Summer crowd. I want an all-out brawl. Actually, horror movie fans, that might be kind of scary. I don't know. Okay, well, as we move away from Brat Summer and into World State Summer with depression, let's talk about Brave New World. Let's get into it. Yeah, so Brave New World is by the author Aldous Huxley, as I think I mentioned already, and it was published for the first time in 1932, I believe. Let me check the copyright page. Yep. And so it's a pretty old book. You might have read it in school. I didn't. I'm not sure if it's a thing that people read in school. Maybe. I don't know.
I never read it in school, and yeah. I was trying to think about it. I don't know if I know anybody who had to read it in school. I feel like it's always mentioned in the same breath as 1984.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think that I've ever met somebody who had to read Brave New World.
I have a funny story about reading this book at a bar, but I'm going to save it for the end. So wait till the end to hear my funny story. Oh,
hell yeah. Set the hook.
So, yeah, published in 1932, and we're just going to jump right into the summary. But I did want to start by reading the epigraph at the beginning of this book. And it is originally in French. I don't speak French, therefore I will not be reading it in French. I will be reading the Google Translate version. And if that's incorrect, it's okay. You can tell me I'm stupid.
If you weren't going to talk about this, I was going to bring it up. So I also have a translation of it. If our translations differ, we can compare notes.
Yeah, let me know. Okay. So, the quote is by Nicholas
Berdiev?
Berdiev? Yeah. Nicholas
That's
Berdiev.
how I would guess at it.
It is. Utopias seem to be much more achievable than we formerly believed them to be. Now we find ourselves presented with another alarming question. How do we prevent utopias from coming into existence? Utopias are possible. Life tends towards the formation of utopias. Perhaps a new century will begin, a century in which intellectuals and the privileged will dream of ways to eliminate utopias and return to a non-utopian society, less perfect and more free. And I'm not going to speak on it anymore until later. Lots of teasers here at the beginning, but that is how the book begins. And then we open into chapter 1. So these first 3 chapters are very dense in terms of content. They are telling you a lot about the world and the way it's built. So I'm just going to kind of take you through it. And Samuel, you're welcome to interject at any point, but I'm also at the end of those like world building chapters. I think I'm going to pause for like, what did I miss? So it opens and we're in this large, clinical, sterile, very impersonal room inside the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center. It says, there's a quote that I liked, "The light was frozen, dead, a ghost." So just think like science laboratory, just gross, bright light. And it is the year AF 632. That stands for after Ford. This is not your present day London, but it's the London of the world state, which is a planet-wide government that controls the entire world. The director of the Hatcheries and Conditioning Center is, I'm going to call him from this point forward, the DHC, is giving a group of students and also future employees a tour of the facilities. And so the center is this site of the production of all civilized human beings in the world. And each individual is predestined for a specific role in society. So people don't become pregnant anymore. They don't give birth to children. Instead, everyone is mass produced inside this center. Well, not this center, but centers throughout the world. And this is the one in London. And so essentially it's this process, and it's very kind of confusing the way it's worded, but they surgically remove ovaries from women, and those produce ova, which are then like fertilized and incubated and kept in these bottles throughout the like gestational period. But it's kind of like IVF, but not quite. And yeah. I don't know if there's like a really great way to explain it, but just everyone's made in a little bottle.
Yeah, and I think that it's also important to note that when they have the fertilized ovary, they then expose it to radiation in order to force the fertilized ovary to split and multiply. Mm-hmm. And they do that up to, I believe, do you know the exact number? I believe it was like 96 times. And so not only is everybody being made in these bottles, but essentially everybody is one of a set of 96 twins that all function within a group.
Yeah. And that process, it has a name. It's called Bokanovsky's process, I think. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it is reserved, just like a slight caveat, for lower caste members of society. So yeah, like I said, humans are predestined for a specific role, and with that, a specific caste in society. So like a social class, and we have alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and epsilon. So gamma, delta, and epsilon members of society go through that process of making 96 identical humans, and those 96 twins essentially are created for the exact same purpose in life, which are typically for gamma, delta, and epsilon members of society, something that's like very labor intensive, working in a factory, working on a farm, things like that. And there's some things that they do, and the DHE is kind of explaining this to students, depending on what type of person these embryos are going to be. to ensure they are conditioned for their specific role in society. So, for example, like epsilon embryos, which is the lowest class, are given less oxygen during development. That way, the embryos are below par. And the DHC says, hasn't it occurred to you that an epsilon embryo must have an epsilon environment as well as epsilon heredity? And then, like, those that are going to work in a tropical climate are conditioned to hot temperatures during incubation, things like that. And then we have alpha and beta classes, and those people are individuals, so they don't have twins. And they are created to be, you know, better looking, better stature, better intelligence, and they do more difficult jobs in society.
Well, they do more intellectually based jobs.
Yeah. I guess difficult is the wrong word because labor is difficult. But they do things that are more based on intelligence. But once again, everything about them is also limited. Everything is controlled in a very specific way. And so this whole process is created to be a form of stability. And so it's an instrument of social stability is what the DHC says. And that kind of aligns with what the world state's motto is, which is community, identity, stability. Oh, one other thing I did not mention about that before we move on is that 70% of women are created to be sterile, whereas the other 30% technically could get pregnant but don't, because they have a very strict regime of like birth control, which we'll talk more about that later. So in this first chapter, we meet two characters other than the DHC, and it's kind of briefly that we meet them, but I'm just going to note them. So we have Henry Foster, and he is an alpha who works at the center. He joins in on the tour, and the DHC is like, can you show the students around and cite data about the work that we do here? And he has like a proclivity for citing figures, and he's very intelligent, but he's very, you can tell, strongly rooted in the work he does and the work that the world state does. And then in passing, we meet Lenina Crown, who's going to be an important character later on. And she is a Beta Plus employee who immunizes embryos. And they really don't say a lot about her other than that she's pretty in the first chapter.
It's that. So you briefly touched on it, but there is also for the like alphas and betas a like plus system where you can be slightly better than other ones. And so I think that technically Henry Foster is an alpha plus, which I believe it goes as high. I feel like the highest that I saw was alpha plus plus, which is like the world controllers.
Yeah. And yeah, there's also with the plus system, there's a minus system. So you can be alpha plus, alpha minus. And it's just, think about grades that you get in school. It's like slightly better or slightly worse than just your basic.
Or tremendously worse. Like I think you said it's epsilon that's the lowest, right?
Epsilon is the lowest, yeah. And epsilons are like kind of empty shells. Like they have little to no intelligence.
Yeah, and it can go as low as I think epsilon minus, which is essentially just a body to do a thing.
Yeah. So big takeaways from chapter 1 is that everyone has an inescapable social destiny, and science and technology, efficiency and production are kind of driving forces in the world. So moving to chapter 2, the DHC continues the tour, but he's taking the students to what's called the infant nurseries and the neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms. If you know Pavlov from psychology, I don't know if I need to explain that, but essentially it's classic conditioning. So Pavlov's bell, the dogs hear the bell, they're conditioned to expect something when they hear the bell. Very brief explanation. If you need more, go look it up. But so here now we see that all children are raised at the center and throughout their childhood are conditioned to believe and feel certain things about the world around them. And conditioned to understand their roles in society. And so first we go into this like bright, sunny room, and there's a bunch of Delta 8-month-old twins, so, you know, maybe 96 Delta twins that are being conditioned to hate books and flowers. So Deltas don't need to read books because that might decondition them, and they probably wouldn't understand them anyways because they're not intelligent enough. They are not, you know, alphas or betas. And they are trained to hate the country, so flowers, but they are also conditioned to love country sports so that they consume public transportation. And the DHE is kind of explaining this as a way to say that, like, we prioritize consumption and we prioritize compliance. Yeah. And so, you know, nature's free. So if you allowed them to love nature, then they would just go be in nature for free rather than consume goods like going to sports games or playing sports. So the way they do this conditioning, and it's not that important to the plot, but it's kind of shocking, is the babies crawl excitedly towards these books and the flowers, but then they're shocked, like an electric shock, and they cry and they're upset. And the DHC tells the students that they undergo this 200 times, so 200 repetitions of that specific conditioning, and there is a lot more conditioning. And then he teaches the students about another form of conditioning, hypnopaedia, or sleep teaching. And he says, well, let me explain sleep teaching, and then I have another note. It essentially means that while the children are asleep, they are having these phrases repeated at them over and over and over. And it's a means they use to instill moral training into individuals in the world state. So it essentially, I was going to read an example of some of the things that they are, you know, told, some of the phrases that they are told during sleep teaching. And these phrases kind of become guiding pillars of society because even as adults, individuals repeat these phrases to each other and to themselves. And it's just so ingrained in them.
Yeah, it talks about the fact that they first started experimenting with hypnopaedia as a way to educate people, but they quickly realized that people were not learning anything other than the phrases in a series. So it mentions somebody listening over and over during their sleep to the phrase about the Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all rivers on the globe. And then the next morning someone says, what's the longest river in the world? And they're like, I don't know. But then they say, don't you remember something that begins with the Nile is the, and then the kid can say, the Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all the rivers of the world. And that just goes on. Like they have the words, but it's just the words. They convey no meaning. It's just a thing that they have. And so they then transition into using that as a means of instilling values in people, because it's a thing that you don't have to have a logical understanding of. Just for the purposes of this society, you just have to know, quote unquote, know that it is true.
So an example of some of the sleep teaching. So the students are observing beta children, so lesser than alpha, but better than everyone else. Better. Wow, that's a bad word, but that's probably what they'd say. So beta children are hearing things like, Delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children. And Epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta. So teaching them class consciousness is what's happening here. And, you know, essentially everything that guides them in the future has been taught through sleep teaching.
Yeah, and it shows later on that every class goes through this, and not only are you being taught to see yourself as better than any class underneath you, you're also being taught to see yourself as less than any class above you, and also being shown, or not shown, but being told that you are incredibly happy with your station in life. So like with this example with betas, they're supposed to see themselves as being smarter and inherently superior to epsilons, gamma, like all of these other groups, but also they're being taught, oh, I'm so glad I'm not an alpha because alphas have to be so hardworking and they work all the time, and that seems
Mm-hmm.
so stressful. And I'm really glad we have alphas, but I'm very happy that I'm a beta. And every class is going through that, where if you go down to the lower class, like any of the lower classes are going to see themselves as inferior, but be conditioned to be happy about their inferiority because the other classes are so clearly harder working.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't really talk about epsilon conditioning, but I wonder, like, I mean, it does, but it doesn't talk about, like, what they hear, but I wonder if it's like, I'm the stupidest of all of the class. like, what? They're not.
Yeah. I mean, based off of the stuff that they talk about in the preconditioning, like environmental conditioning stuff, I would assume there would be very little need to condition someone who was an epsilon because it's talking about intentional infusions of alcohol into their blood
Mm-hmm.
and intentional like disturbing of like deprivation of oxygen and food and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're doing everything that they can to have these specific children be born with a tremendous amount of challenges to overcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, they have total social and societal control through this conditioning system. And then the last thing I want to mention is that something is said, over and over they keep using the term Ford. Like they say, oh, Ford and our Ford. And, you're kind of wondering up until this point, like, who's Ford? It's after Ford is the way that they gauge how time goes on. And so then it says that sleep teaching's discovery came just 23 years after R. Ford's T model was put on the market. And that is when we get confirmation that this godlike figure of the world state is, in fact, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company.
Yes. Which
And
also begins to put into perspective the timeline that we're operating under.
mm-hmm.
Because once you realize that the date AF is after Ford, I wrote it down. The first Model T came off the line in 1908. And so basically all of these dates that we're looking at, like with the 600 AF, it's basically around 2500 AD,
Mm-hmm.
like CE,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when they speak sometimes of Henry Ford, they will make the sign of a T over their stomachs, which is kind of like, think of it in a way that maybe someone who's Catholic would do a crucifix, the sign of the cross. It's like that. It's just like a compulsory movement they do to honor Henry Ford because they value industrial production or something. Um, so moving into chapter 3, so now the DHC takes the students into a garden where a group of children are engaging in play. And some of them are playing a complex game that requires very specific machinery, and he explains that all games are designed to increase consumption. And then the other children are engaging in, bear with me, it gets weird, erotic play. And so he explains that sexual play between children was once considered, abnormal and was repressed until they were upwards of 20, but that had terrible results for society. And then in walks our Ford ship, Mustafa Mond. And Mustafa Mond is the resident controller for Western Europe. So think like world leader, president, prime minister. He's one of the 10 controllers of the world, which is the highest possible job in society. And they do refer to him as his Ford ship, our Ford ship.
Yeah, he's basically supposed to be seen as like a pope figure where he is the head, he is a spokesperson for Ford. He is basically Ford's emissary to the modern day, and what he says should be taken as from the mouth of Ford.
Mm-hmm. And then we also, before we get into the next part, we meet another character briefly who is very important, Bernard Marx. And Bernard Marx is an Alpha Plus who works at the Psychology Bureau as a hypnopaedia specialist. So he knows a lot about sleep teaching, but he looks different than your normal alpha. He's a smaller stature. He is not liked by most people. He has what's considered to be heretical views, and he's very different. So think Winston Smith. And we meet him in passing. And so then the book switches back and forth between several different scenes in the rest of the chapter, and it's really interesting from a writing perspective. I don't understand why Huxley chose to do this.
Yeah, I will say that from this chapter and from this specific section of the book, I thought that this book was going to be significantly more structurally abstract and like experimental than it ended up being, because it's just like a one sentence paragraph and then a page break and then another paragraph and then a page break and then just one quote, and all of them are happening in by different people at different times, and you just kind of have to put together from the context what is happening, and all of these are happening at the same time. And I found it really interesting. I liked it a lot. It felt so weird that he doesn't follow this up with anything. Like, it never does it again in the rest of the book.
No, it's the only time that he chooses to do that. So I'm going to just take you through each scene that's happening, rather than, obviously going back and forth. So the first thing that's going on is Mustafa Maan, World Controller, is giving a speech to these students that the DHC has been giving a tour to. And he's telling them about the history of the world and how the world state came to be. So broad strokes, he says, there used to be religion, alcohol, mothers and fathers, democracy, all these things. And he says people had the liberty to be inefficient and miserable, which is a funny line to me. But then came the 9 Years' War, and it was a major war. It was devastating. There was chemical warfare, biological warfare, all the bad things. And as, we were facing economic collapse in the world, there became a choice, he says. And there was a choice between world control or world destruction, which seems pretty dire, pretty intense. And so the world state took power. And first they tried taking power through aggressive, weaponry-based, forceful-based means, but they saw that didn't really work. And this is where we diverge really interestingly from like the way that 1984 takes power, the government in 1984. And instead they choose to take power by conditioning, by just creating a utopia, a perfect class, a society of people. And so they destroyed all books before AF 150. They closed museums. They blew up historical monuments. And they chose the date of the T-model release as the date that the new era of society began. And they prioritized stability, happiness, and consumption, community, identity, and stability. And they preserved youth forever until death. Everyone remains youthful until age 60, I think it says, and then they die. And then another thing they did is, instead of having alcohol and a variety of drugs, they created one drug called Soma, and it's the perfect drug. It gives you this feeling of euphoria and escape and happiness without any negative side effects. And it's rationed. It's only to be taken in certain dosages in certain ways. And we'll talk more about Soma later, I think. But that's kind of...
Soma's like really important.
Yeah. That's kind of the big picture for what he tells the students. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I wanted to add that the purpose for all of this, or like the thing that they are trying to achieve, the thing that they believe is going to create this social stability, is essentially completely eliminating want or desire as something that people have to deal with, and making the gap between the thought of want and the fulfillment of want zero. So the one quote that I had flagged that I want to talk about later is, "Feeling lurks in that interval of time between desire and its consummation. Shorten that interval, break down all those unnecessary barriers. Fortunate boys," said the controller, "no pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy, to preserve you, so far that is possible, from having emotions at all."
Yeah. And they experience pleasure, a lot of pleasure. I think something I haven't made very clear yet, but I'm about to in explaining the other two situations, is that everyone is sexually free and active to have sex with anyone and everyone they want to, and that's encouraged. It's encouraged in the children and their conditioning, and it's encouraged in adulthood, but it's not encouraged to have intimate relationships, emotionally intimate relationships. Yeah. And so then the other two scenarios that are going on at the same time, one is Henry Foster, so that perfect example of a world state man. He is talking with a friend who's kind of insignificant, so I'm not gonna... he's talking with a friend, another employee, about his date that night with Lenina Crown, who we met earlier. And essentially in talking about her, they're sexualizing her, and they're talking about having sex with her very openly, and Henry saying, you should have her, you should sleep with her, she's particularly pneumatic, which is a word they use a lot. And then overhearing that conversation, because they're in the men's changing room after work, Bernard Marx is very angry at the way that they're talking about Lenina like she's just a piece of meat. And he's upset and he's raging against them, which is different from what you would expect someone in this society to feel, because everyone belongs to everyone is one of their sleep teaching mottos. And so then Henry and his friend go over and they get Bernard worked up because they know they can, and people don't like him and they know that he's different. And at the same time, Lenina Crown is in the female changing room, and she's having a conversation with her friend Fanny Crown, who is not related to her. Well, probably everyone's probably related to, but they only have like a select amount of names they use in the world and a select amount of last names, so a lot of people have the same last name even if they're not, like, there's no relation in general because there's not mothers and fathers and families, and so it's insignificant that they have the same last name. But Lenina and Fanny are talking about first Lenina's date with Henry Foster that night. But then Lenina's saying she's not been feeling very promiscuous. She's not been interested in having sex and relations with a lot of other men, having only dated Henry Foster for some time now. And Fanny scolds her and is like, it's very important to engage in promiscuity. Everyone belongs to everyone. What are you doing? And so then Lenina says, well, I was considering going out with Bernard Marx because he invited me to join him on holiday. But she's debating whether to go because, he's weird. And there's this rumor that they poured alcohol in his bottle when he was being born because that's why he looks different and everyone judges him. And she's debating whether to go because he has invited her to go to the Savage Reservation. And so that is what they call the place where, quote unquote, uncivilized people live in the world state. That is how Aldous Huxley describes this reservation. I will thus forward be calling it a reservation because I don't like that terminology, but that is what they say. He's invited me to go on vacation to see what the quote-unquote uncivilized people are like.
Yeah.
And so she's trying to decide whether she should go, and ultimately she decides that she does want to go because she thinks Bernard is sweet. So that is the first 3 chapters, and like I said, we learn a whole lot about the world. If you need to pause the podcast, take a breather to take it all in, you can do that. Samuel, do you have anything to add before we move forward?
I think that it's going to come up more later on, but I did want to, because I flagged it in my book, point out that the way in which this book refers to indigenous populations is not the only example in which this book says things that are questionable in terms of racism. Specifically, early on in page 9 of this book, they're talking about the capacity for various ovaries and uteruses to produce more offspring. Mm-hmm. And this is a direct quote. I don't love this terminology, but they are talking about the fact that there is, I'll just read it out, is that a single ovary for this specific center, the record for a ovary producing offspring is 16,012. However, in some of the tropical centers, they've done significantly better, such as in Singapore, they've produced over 16,500. And in Mombasa, they've touched the 17,000 mark. And then it says, quote, but then they have unfair advantages. You should see the way a Negro ovary responds to pituitary. I just, getting into the remainder of this book, I just kind of want it to be kept in mind that there's been several moments in this book so far where Aldous Huxley, or the characters in the book, or the world in which they're living in, have said things that are overtly racist.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely think we will be talking about this a lot more in our analysis episode, and probably in our next episode as well, talking about historical context. But yeah, I think, just as a note going forward, like, I will do my best to, I might like initially say the terminology that Huxley uses, unless it's just like insane. But
yeah, there's at least 2 times that I know of that he uses a slur.
Yeah, but other than that, I and Samuel will be changing the terminology to something not racist. But yeah, just a note about the book. So moving into the rest of the book, we're going more now from learning about the world, which we do keep doing, but into just like plot. And so Lenina and Henry are about to leave for their date, where they go play electromagnetic golf, I believe.
Yeah.
I didn't write it down because it's not super significant. They just go on a date. But before they leave for this date, Lenina goes over to Bernard and accepts his invitation for a date, as well as to go to the reservation. And this upsets Bernard because he wanted their exchange to be private, showing that he's once again different. He's not like the other boys. He didn't like that Lenina behaved like a, quote, healthy and virtuous English girl, and not in a abnormal, extraordinary way. And pretty much, yeah, they go on their date, Lenina and Henry, and Bernard leaves work and goes to visit a friend, Helmholtz Watson, who is an Alpha Plus professor at the College of Emotional Engineering and Propaganda writer. So he's a professor and he writes propaganda. And Watson and Bernard Marx, have something in common, and it's that they are both dissatisfied by society. But for Watson, it's because he's very intelligent, and he feels as though his writing skills could be better used than for making sleep teaching phrases. He feels like he could make more. He could create art, which that's not really the word he's using, but he feels that he could. Whereas for Bernard, he feels dissatisfied and like an outsider just because he is physically different and therefore is rejected by those like him. So while they don't have a lot in common in terms of personality, what they do have is that they're both individuals, which is not common. Later, Bernard and Lenina go on their first date, and he's once again very weird during this date. And so Lenina proposes a couple different activities. She proposes going to the country club and then dinner, and he doesn't want to do that. It's too much of a crowd. And she proposes going to play electromagnetic golf. He's like, no, electromagnetic golf is a waste of time. They can't figure out what to do.
And I'd put a flag in it. I specifically wanted in that section to say the quote of, she proposes the electromagnetic golf at St. Andrews, and it says, but again, no, Bernard considered that electromagnetic golf was a waste of time. Then what's time for? Asked Lenina in some astonishment, implying that the point of time is to waste it.
Yeah. And then they go and they watch the Women's Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. So they do end up in a crowd, and he's very irritable and not enjoying it. And the date isn't really going super well. And she tries to persuade him to take soma because he's not happy, and he refuses it. He's angry. He doesn't like this. She suggests that. She quotes a sleep teaching phrase that is, "A gram in time saves 9." And that makes him even more angry. And things are bad. He yells at her, says, "For Ford's sake, be quiet." And then eventually they leave, and they're flying back to his apartment, because what you do at the conclusion of every date is go have sex. But as they're doing that, he stops over the channel, the body of water, and gets as close as he can to the waves in the helicopter, and he just hovers over it because the weather is bad, and so it's causing the waves to be bigger. And he's like, "Look at that." And Lenina's upset, and she's like, "It's horrible. Why are you making me look at this horrible weather? And let's turn on the radio. I don't want to hear these noises. Why do you want to do this? I don't understand." And he was like, "I want to be alone here with you." And Lenina's like, "We're going to be alone later," thinking we're going to have sex later. And he's like, "No, I want intimacy," essentially is what he's saying. Mm-hmm. And then they have this back and forth discourse where he's kind of starting to say some of his heretical views out loud, the things that he's wanting for, and they're just confusing her. She's crying, she's upset, she doesn't understand what he's trying to say. And so he says things like, "Don't you wish you were free, Lenina? And wouldn't you like to be free in..." Because she says, "Everybody's happy nowadays," which is a sleep teaching phrase. And he says, "Wouldn't you like to be free in some other way, in your own way, not in everyone else's way?" And she just doesn't understand.
Yeah.
And then they go home and they do have sex because Bernard realizes she's not going to understand. And as of right now, Lenina is just a good girl, a good member of society who's doing exactly what's expected of her. And he sees that he's not going to get out of her what he's seeking. So then, they get this permit to go to New Mexico to visit the indigenous reservation on their vacation, on their holiday.
Yeah.
And they do. They go. And we get there and we see that the reservation is very unlike the world state society that they live in. And it's also notably fenced in. There is a warden. These people are trapped here. And the fence is like electric fence. Like if they try to escape, they'll instantly die. And they're kind of getting a tour and realizing how just retained these people are in prior society. And I don't love any of this. I don't love the way any of it's classified. I don't love the way it's described. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, actually. Essentially, they still have religion. They still have music and dancing and culture and intimacy and interpersonal relationships and all the things that they don't have in the world state, they have at the reservation. But they also have all the what are perceived to be bad things like death and pain and suffering and sickness, and people do bad things like cheat on their partners, and people are angered and they atone for their sins by being beat. And, honestly, it seems like Huxley's trying to take everything that's ever happened in society before this time and say that they do all of it.
Yeah, I'm going to have a lot to say about this chapter later on, because I have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, and they speak several different languages, notably Zuni, I believe is how you pronounce it, which is an indigenous language of the Pueblo people. I don't know how accurate any of it is, actually. I wouldn't guess very. But anyways, Huxley did not speak this language.
It's got a lot of references to indigenous peoples and indigenous cultures, where it's kind of trying to combine all indigenous people into one tribe and one set of beliefs. My boyfriend, my partner, is an indigenous man, and I have had him look over some of this stuff, and The degree to which it is an accurate reflection of anybody's actual lived beliefs and experiences is hit or miss for a lot of it.
Yeah. So, anyways, they're walking through the reservation. Like I said, they see this ritual, I guess, where a younger boy about age 18 is being beat with a whip. And it's kind of a sacrifice in so that they will have their corn will grow, they will receive rain for their agricultural crops. And I would say both Bernard and Lenina are disgusted by it, but Bernard is also fascinated at the same time, whereas Lenina is like, get me out of this hellscape. I'm so upset by everything that I'm seeing. And as they are watching this, it ends, and this person comes up to them that lives on the reservation.
Look out, folks. We got a token white boy.
And his name is John. And, you know, Bernard and Lenina are surprised. There's this white boy walking up to them, and they're like, what's going on? He looks like us. Oh, my God. And John approaches them and just begins like excitedly talking about how he wished that it were him being sacrificed, and he's kind of erratic, and they're like, who is this kid? And he says like, I want to be a part of this because I've not been accepted by my tribe. I don't actually know like how he describes it, but he's saying that like he wants to be a sacrifice because he hasn't been accepted by his people on the reservation because he's white. And like, whoa, that's crazy. Anyways,
Yeah, the exact quote was, but they wouldn't let me. They disliked me for my complexion. It's always been like that. Always. Tears stood in the young man's eyes. He was ashamed and turned away. Aw, the white boy's getting a racism. Aw.
yeah. And so here we have the third person in this book that's an outsider. So we have Bernard Marx, and then we had Watson, and now we have John. And they're all outsiders for different reasons, but I think John and Bernard have a bit more in common in that they just look different from the people around them and are a bit different. So then we quickly learn that John is different because of his mother. And whoa, it's about to get crazy, folks. So he says, like, I want you to go meet my mother. And so he takes them to meet her, and turns out that she is a woman who once lived in the world state as a beta. And she came on holiday, like Lenina and Bernard, to the reservation, but then like fell off a cliff or something. Like she fell, and she didn't die, but she was very hurt. And the person she came on holiday with, I'm going to save that reveal for later, left her. He looked for her initially, but wasn't able to find her, and so went back to London to their society and left her on the reservation. And so the people of the reservation found her, and they nursed her back to health, and she went on to live there for a long time. It turns out she was pregnant, and so she gave birth to John. Linda lives out her days on the reservation kind of in resentment of where she is and wanting to be back in London, back in the society that she came from. She misses the luxury, she misses the consumption, the pleasure. She misses having sex with whoever she wants, because when she does that on the reservation, she angers people. They call her a whore, and she has sex with other women's husbands, men, I don't know.
Husbands and partners is, I think, how it describes
husbands and partners, and the women come and beat her with a whip for it. So no one gets her. No one understands where she comes from and why she is the way she is, or that's how she feels. And the thing she misses the most is the soma, because that removes all of the unhappiness of the world. She can't turn to soma for leaving reality, and so instead she turns to alcohol, mezcal, which makes her feel hungover and bad. So it's not the same.
This is a gross portion.
Yeah.
It's really just kind of saying, we can get more into this at a different point probably, but
Hmm.
I feel like it is showing alcoholism in a really gross light. This is somebody who's suffering from alcoholism, and it's kind of saying, oh, it's just because she's choosing to do so in order to escape the world.
Hmm. And then, so Lenina's kind of talking about how she misses, not Lenina, Linda is talking to Lenina about missing all the pleasures of the world. Lenina remains perpetually disgusted by Linda because she has suffered from old age, and that's not something that happens in the world state. She is old and wrinkly and has gained a lot of weight in her years, and Lenina thinks she's gross. At the same time, Bernard is listening to John tell the story of his life, and essentially John just talks about being an outsider, but simultaneously loving the culture and traditions of the reservation, but not being accepted by the people of the reservation. But also, his mom raised him to learn about the wonders of the world state, of this other world, and he is fascinated with it and wants to experience it. But also, his mom's kind of abusive and like hates being his mother, but also derives pleasure in having a companion. I don't know. So ultimately, Bernard says, "How about you, John, come back with me to London?" And then he's like, "And my mother too, of course." And he's like, "Yeah, sure, Linda too." And so Bernard gets approval to bring John and Linda back with them to London, and off they go. And we get to London, and it turns out that because of Bernard's heretical views, he was about to be dismissed from the London Society to kind of be banished to an island. And so he wasn't going to be, like nothing was going to happen to him physically. He was just going to be put in a place where other people who are a little bit different are. And he does not want that, because ultimately, even though Bernard is different, he just wants to fit in. He just wants to be like the people in the society. And so he derives this plan to bring John, who they call a name that I'm not going to use because I already said I wasn't going to use it, but they call him kind of like a slur throughout the rest of the book, and bring him to the world state so he can be studied, because he's a white boy who grew up on a reservation. And when he does this, it also turns out that the director, the DHC of the center, he was the man who went to the reservation with Linda. And he's the one who got her pregnant. And he's so ashamed that he quits his job and leaves and kind of goes into hiding, which works out well for Bernard because the director is the one that wanted him dismissed. So then the rest of the book continues to be awful. And they're studying John. They're studying who he is and why he believes what he believes. And they treat him like an animal, like a zoo animal. Everyone's fascinated with him. Bernard grows immensely popular because everyone wants to come and meet John and engage with John. And it's gross. And Bernard is thriving off of it. He's like having sex with all these women and having all these important people over to his apartment, and he's using John for this social gain. But John is growing increasingly disillusioned and disgusted with the society that he had looked forward to learning about. Because what he's realizing is, while there is pleasure in consumption and quote unquote happiness, that happiness is fleeting and that happiness is empty because it lacks humanity, it lacks emotion, and it lacks feeling. At the same time, Linda, she gets her soma back, and she takes so much soma that she dies at the end. That's Linda's story.
Yeah. It seems to me like she probably already had some pre-existing conditions going on as a result of living so long with alcoholism. But she does basically get back, and in the society of London, they don't necessarily care about curing ailments that are end of life ailments and stuff like that. It's more about just make people comfortable until they die. And so yeah, they bring both Linda and John back to London, and Linda just spends the rest of her life on a permanent vacation using soma until she dies in a hospital.
which is very troubling to John, who felt genuine love for her because that's his mother, but I don't know that Linda necessarily had that connection with him in the same way, at least. She had a connection with him, but it's a little more complex. And so we learn a lot about John, and one thing is that when he was a child, his mother gave him a book. And it was a book from the World State, and he learned to read. She helped teach him to read, and he loved reading, but he found that book to be boring. Later, one of the men that Linda had been sleeping with left a book at their home, which was the collected works of William Shakespeare. And John loves William Shakespeare. He quotes William Shakespeare all the time, and he thinks that William Shakespeare kind of represents the complexity of human emotion and the beauty of life. And I think I'm going to kind of just skip to the end of the book at this point, unless you have anything else you want to add about the in-between of John's time in society.
I think that I've got some things that I'll point out in later parts that I thought were interesting and relevant, but yeah, you've kind of summed it up, where it's just a lot of them showing John the new world and him disliking it, mainly because he finds it overly superficial, and he feels as though it lacks the depth of emotion that the world that he was living in previously had. And I also, just as a side note, want to say that because of the fact that the bulk of John's education and experience with English comes through reading Shakespeare, he speaks like an asshole the entire book. And he's meant to be the main character. He's the guy you're rooting for. He's the protagonist. He is saying shit like strumpet and zounds and like it's
very
a lot.
Pretentious. And he's quoting Shakespeare, and I want to talk a lot about this section in the analysis episode, but that's kind of the main ideas that you need to understand. So he's very unhappy, and ultimately when Linda dies, he kind of throws a fit. He makes a scene, and it requires first Bernard and Watson show up, and they are trying to calm him down. They can't, and then kind of the police, essentially, some officials come and calm down the scene. It's like an anti-riot agency, but they do it with putting soma and scents into the air.
Yeah, aerosolizing drugs.
Yeah. And so they calm everyone down, and they take all three men into custody.
Yes.
And those men are taken directly to the controller, our Fordship, Mustafa Man's office.
Yes.
And these last two...
something else that I just realized that we hadn't touched on yet is that John is in love with Lenina.
Oh, yeah, I totally forgot that. Sorry. John's in love with Lenina, but he won't have sex with her because he doesn't believe in sex before marriage, essentially. He believes in commitment and intimacy and showing and proving your love. Lenina doesn't understand, but Lenina's becoming increasingly heretical, honestly, because she loves John too, but it's not the same. She kind of has a lust for John, and she's pursuing him and would like to have sex with him, and is not understanding why he won't have sex with her, and the entire time he's kind of saying, I'm not going to do that because I haven't proven my love to you yet. Like, I haven't gone out and slayed a lion for you to show you how much I care. I haven't gone out and brought you the skin of a bear or something like that. Like, yeah. So that'll come up a lot more later, but yeah, he's in love with Lenina. He won't do anything about it because doing something about it before proving himself to her makes him feel uncomfortable, and also the thought that she would let him have sex with her before he had proven himself makes him think less of her. He thinks she's a whore.
A strumpet, if you will.
A strumpet. Yeah, but she also doesn't want to be with anyone else, which is odd for her. Well, not odd. She was kind of feeling that way at the beginning, but it's becoming increasingly more of a problem. And so then they're in Mustafa Man's office, and I actually think these chapters are really interesting in that they tell you a lot about... It's kind of like the end of 1984, where Winston Smith is learning about everything that makes the world go round in 1984, and the ideals, and there's a lot of doublethink, if you will, in these chapters. But I don't think I'm really going to talk about it right now, because I think we can later. But he's explaining to them, and more so, Mustafa Man's explaining to John, yes, there is beauty in the world. Yes, there is religion. Yes, there's God. Yes, there's all these things. But those things do not allow us to have stability. So we choose not to have those things. We choose indoctrination. We choose control of these impulses, if you will. And then Bernard and Watson are sent to islands. They're going to be sent to islands for their heretical views and opinions. And essentially, Mustafa Man's giving John the option to choose the world state beliefs or not. And John says, no, I like the inconveniences. And then he says a quote that I've seen a lot from this book, which is, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. And that's that. John says, no, I don't want your society. And Mustafa Man wants John to stay. He wants to continue studying him. But John does not want to do that. So he runs away. And he finds a lighthouse to live in isolation for the rest of his days. And then there he's just kind of losing it. He's trying to atone for all the sins he has committed. He's trying to atone for still wanting Lenina, but knowing it's wrong. He's beating himself with a whip. He's yelling out, and people of the world are taking notice, and they come and they film him, and he's on the news, and they secretly create a movie about him, and he hates it, and he's yelling at them. And the culmination of it all is, like, after the movie releases, a bunch of people come visit, and one of the people who comes to visit is Lenina, and she steps out of a helicopter with Henry Foster. But she clearly still feels something for him, and she walks toward him with her arms outstretched, and it angers John. He tries to throw the whip at her, and then he starts whipping himself. Everyone's excited by this. He's a spectacle. They see him as entertainment, and they go to come back the next day to watch John be this different person.
Yeah, it's become like a spectacle of him walking around in circles, whipping himself, like self-flagellating, and everybody is chanting, "We want the whip, we want the whip." And yeah, like you said, Lenina shows up and he rebukes her. He chases her with the whip, calling her a strumpet and a fichu. And yeah, then they come back the next day to see another display of his aggression.
And he's killed himself.
Oh my god, he's unalived.
That's the end of the book. That's all, folks. That's Brave New World.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say about this book, but that's the plot.
We will save further discussion for next week, as well as mostly our third episode on this book, which will be the analysis episode. Sorry if this one was a bit long. It was my first summary episode, and I was still trying to get the hang of pacing. So thank you for bearing with me. If you made it all the way to the end, I promised you a story. And here the story is. I was sitting at a bar by myself reading this book, just enjoying a drink, trying to get through it so I could be ready to talk about it with you guys. And this man, middle-aged man, I hope he doesn't listen to this podcast. I did not tell him about the podcast because this middle-aged man asked me, like, do you mind telling me what you're reading? And I was like, oh, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. He starts talking to me about it. And then he did this thing that, like, you know, men often do when talking to young women much younger than them, where he starts trying to sound smart. And he was like, it sounds very Orwellian to me. Do you know who George Orwell is?
Wait, had he not read Brave New World?
No, he hadn't heard of it. But then he called it Orwellian, and he asked me if I knew who George Orwell was. And I said, yeah. And he's like, have you read 1984? And I was like, yeah. So that's my story.
That's such a... We can get into it in the analysis episode, but that's such a dumb take because this is anti-Orwellian. This is the opposite of an Orwellian future. Yeah, just because it's dystopian doesn't make it Orwellian.
Mm-hmm. It was a very interesting interaction, and I really just wanted to read my book. But yeah, so thank you again for listening. I was going to close this episode with a game, but I feel that it's been very long, so I hope that you're okay with my story about a man mansplaining satire to me in a bar. Is that okay with you, Samuel?
That's always fine with me. If I have a story about somebody trying to mansplain satire in a bar to me, I'll be sure to bring it next week.
Great, perfect. We will be playing fun games next week at the end of our discussion about Aldous Huxley, who he was, the historical context of this book. But until then, we hope that you enjoyed, this slightly, no, not slightly, very problematic book. I would love it if you would follow us on our social media. We can be found on Instagram at the Satire Fire Pod, that's POD, or on TikTok and Blue Sky and YouTube at the Satire Fire. You can DM us there, you can comment, you can engage, you can tell us your thoughts on Brave New World, you can tell us your recommendations for books you'd like us to read. Samuel, is there anything you want to tell the people before we go?
Yeah, just thanks for listening. We got a lot of good comments and feedback and support for the 1984 episodes, and we hope that you enjoy the series as well.
Yeah, well, I hope that you have a day filled with pleasure and consumption and lack of human emotion. No, I'm just kidding. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks for listening. This has been the Satire Fire. I'm Sydney.
And I am Samuel.
And we'll catch you next week.
Bye.